The night glittered in Lagos as the city's elite gathered under the chandeliers of a grand ballroom. Expensive perfumes floated in the air, blending with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Politicians, business tycoons, and socialites dressed in shimmering fabrics filled the room, each trying to outshine the other. The spotlight, however, seemed to rest most on Chaik, a man who loved to be noticed. He moved with confidence, shaking hands firmly, his laughter loud enough to command attention. People praised his charm, his success, and his way of owning the room. By his side stood Amara, his wife. She wore a soft, elegant gown, nothing too flashy, but graceful enough to turn heads. Yet, while others noticed her beauty, Chaik treated her like an accessory, a part of his image rather than a partner. He rarely introduced her properly, often cutting her words short if she tried to speak. To the guests, she appeared calm, smiling politely, standing quietly beside him. But deep inside, she carried the weight of silence. Behind closed doors, the truth was darker. Chaik had a way of shrinking her spirit. He mocked her ideas, dismissed her opinions, and made her feel invisible in her own home. Tonight was no different. The grand party may have been a stage for him to shine, but for Amara, it was another test of endurance, another evening where her pain was hidden behind practiced grace. In the glow of the lights, no one could see the quiet storm she carried within. The night had reached its peak. Music played softly in the background while waiters carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Guests clustered in small groups, sharing gossip, laughter, and business secrets. Chaik thrived in this environment. He loved being the loudest voice in the room, always eager for attention. With a glass of wine in hand, he stood in the center of a circle of guests, boasting about his achievements, his influence, and his supposed brilliance. Amara stood beside him, her posture graceful, her eyes lowered. She knew these moments well. Chaik always used parties as a stage to lift himself higher, and too often he did so by pushing her lower. Tonight was no different. As he bragged, his hand rested on Amara's shoulder, not with affection, but as if she were a prop. Then, with a grin, he said words that sliced through her heart. "Look at my wife," he announced loudly. "Pretty, yes, but honestly, she's useless. Not like the other women here. See how accomplished, how glamorous they are. She just stays home and does nothing." For a moment, silence fell, then soft chuckles rippled through the group. A few people laughed openly, trying to stay in Chaik's good graces. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak. The sound of their laughter rang in Amara's ears like cruel music. Amara's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She forced a small smile, though her chest ached. She had learned long ago not to defend herself. Every time she tried, he would cut her down even more. Tonight, with so many eyes on her, she swallowed her words like bitter medicine. Her heart burned, but her face remained calm. Some women in the circle glanced at her with pity, but no one spoke up. Chaik continued, laughing at his own cruel joke, raising his glass as if he had said something clever. The guests followed his lead, clinking glasses and laughing again. To them, it was just another party moment, quickly forgotten. But for Amara, it was another wound added to the many scars she carried in silence. She stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes fixed on the chandelier above to stop the tears from spilling. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Inside, however, she felt small, trapped in a cage no one else could see. All around her, the party sparkled. Laughter rose, cameras flashed, deals were whispered over wine glasses. Yet, in the middle of all that glitter, Amara felt invisible. The crowd saw her standing there, but no one truly saw her pain. And as her husband's laughter filled the room again, she silently told herself to endure. Just endure. Tund moved carefully through the glittering hall, balancing a silver tray of drinks as if it were part of his body. The ballroom was alive with chatter, laughter, and the soft clinking of glasses, but his eyes were not on the guests who demanded his attention. They were on her, Amara. He had seen it happen. The sharp words from her husband, the cruel laughter that followed, the way her smile stayed on her face even though her eyes dimmed. Others treated it like a joke, but Tund felt the sting of it deep inside. He was just a waiter, invisible to the powerful men and glamorous women in the room, but he noticed things that others ignored. Tonight he noticed her. Amara stood so still, almost too still, like someone holding herself together with invisible threads. She did not argue back, did not cry, did not leave. She simply remained there, her chin slightly lifted, her eyes fixed on something beyond the glittering chandelier, as though she was looking far away from the humiliation around. To Tund, that silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. He had seen people break down for far less, but Amara stood like a tree rooted in a storm. As he moved from one corner of the hall to the other, offering champagne flutes to guests, his eyes kept drifting back to her. Something about her didn't match the story her husband painted. She didn't look useless. She carried herself with quiet grace, the kind that didn't need to shout. There was dignity in her stillness, even when people laughed at her expense. Tund couldn't explain why, but it felt as though she was more than what she allowed people to see. Maybe it was the way she held her shoulders. Maybe it was the calm in her eye. She looked like someone who knew her own worth, even if no one else in the room did. And that made Tund curious, almost protective, even though he was a stranger in her world. Every time Chaik raised his voice to brag, Tund's jaw tightened. Every time the guests laughed at Amara, Tund's chest ached. He wanted to step forward, to say something, but he knew his place. In this grand hall, he was just a young waiter from a modest background. No one cared about his opinions. Still, he couldn't look away. Between serving drinks and clearing empty glasses, he kept stealing glances at her. And each time, he felt more certain. Amara was not the weak, invisible woman her husband wanted the world to see. She was something else, something hidden, like a flame carefully shielded from the wind. The others laughed and forgot. But Tund remembered. He carried her image with him, tucked deep inside, as though he already knew the night wasn't over, and Amara's story had only just begun. As Amara stood quietly beside her husband, her smile frozen in place, her mind slipped away from the noisy ballroom. The laughter, the flashing cameras, the clinking glasses, they all blurred into the background. She was used to these nights, used to being treated as a shadow. But deep inside, she knew a truth no one here suspected. They called her useless. They thought she was only Chaik's wife. But years before this marriage, Amara had built something powerful with her own hands. While studying late nights in her small apartment, she had started a simple idea on her laptop, a software company she named Zenith Tech. To protect her peace, she never attached her real name. She registered it under a different identity, keeping herself hidden while her company grew. Investors believed in the vision, businesses relied on the technology, and slowly, quietly, Zenith Tech became one of the biggest forces in the Nigerian tech space. Tonight, many of the men shaking Chaik's hand owed their success to the very company Amara had built. She knew their contracts, their shares, their dependencies. Half the businesses represented in this ballroom were tied to Zenith Tech in one way or another. They didn't know she was their silent partner. And Chaik, loud and boastful Chaik, had no idea that the woman he belittled owned more wealth and influence than he could ever dream of. Amara remembered the night she chose to hide her identity. It wasn't fear, it was freedom. She had seen how fame consumed people, how greed and envy followed those in the spotlight. She wanted peace, a life where she could walk the market unnoticed, laugh with old friends, and enjoy her work without constant judgment. She didn't want to be worshipped, and she didn't want to be envied. So she stayed invisible, content to let the company shine while she remained in the shadows. But standing here tonight, listening to her husband mock her, she felt the weight of that decision. If she wanted, she could silence every laugh in this hall with a single word. She could pull back the curtain and show them all who she really was. But she didn't. Not yet. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was patience. She looked around the ballroom with calm eyes. The governors, the CEOs, the tycoons, all of them wore their power like crowns. Yet she knew their secrets. She knew whose company was on the verge of bankruptcy, who owed millions to Zenith Tech, who begged for renewals of contracts she had signed off on quietly. To them, she was invisible. To her, they were transparent. Amara's lips curved into a faint smile, not the kind Chaik expected, but one born from knowing. Let him call her useless. Let them laugh. They had no idea the most powerful person in the room was the woman standing quietly in the shadows, pretending to be small. The dinner had begun, and the room was alive with murmurs and laughter. Crystal glasses reflected the warm light, plates clinked softly, and waiters moved carefully between the tables. Tund carried a tray stacked with champagne flutes, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease, but his eyes kept drifting back to her. Amara. She sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap, a polite smile in place. Chaik was in his usual element, laughing loudly at his own jokes, drawing attention like a magnet. Amara let the world pass over her as she often did, keeping her face calm while her mind raced. She was used to being ignored, or worse, ridiculed, but tonight, something felt different. As Tund passed by her table, a slight slip made the tray tilt. Glasses rattled and nearly fell, and he caught them just in time. Heart racing, he bent slightly and whispered, barely audible over the din, "Ma'am, I know who you are." Amara froze. The words hung in the air, small but heavy. She looked down at him, searching his face. There was no mockery, no joke, no greed, just honesty. His eyes held recognition, a quiet understanding that startled her more than the chaos of the room ever could. Her heart skipped a beat. For the first time that evening, someone saw her, not the wife, not the accessory, not the shadow standing beside a boastful man, but her. "Who?" she whispered, unsure if she dared to ask. Tund smiled faintly, almost shyly, and shook his head. "You don't need to tell me. I know." He straightened, keeping the tray steady, but his glance never left her. The boldness in his words, the certainty in his gaze, made her feel a rush of both fear and relief. Fear because someone had seen through her carefully built veil, and relief because for the first time, it wasn't her husband. Amara's mind whirled. Every second of this party, the laughter, the applause, Chike's mocking tone, suddenly seemed smaller, like it belonged to another world. She realized then that her secrets were no longer entirely hers. Someone she hadn't even expected, had noticed the truth she had hidden so carefully. She felt a strange warmth rise in her chest. The power of being seen, not for the role others expected, but for who she truly was intoxicating. She kept her voice steady, calm, practiced, as she murmured, "I see." Tund gave a slight nod and moved on, blending back into the flow of waiters. But the moment stayed with her. The awareness that someone recognized her, that someone knew her worth beyond her husband's shadow, ignited something quiet but fierce inside her. The rest of the night, the laughter and mockery felt different. They were no longer a cage. They were a stage, and now, for the first time, she felt ready to step out of the shadows. Chike was in his element, holding court at the center of the room. Every laugh, every nod, every approving glance from the guests fed him like fuel. He spoke loudly about deals he had closed, companies he had saved, and the power he wielded in Lagos business circle. His stories were exaggerated, polished, rehearsed. Every now and then, he'd glance at Amara with a smirk, making sure everyone saw the useless woman standing quietly by his side. Amara listened, her smile calm, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She had long ago learned how to wear patience like armor. Chike mocked her in subtle ways, pointing out that she had no independent achievements, no social clout, no glamorous presence to match his own. Guests chuckled politely, a few laughed too loudly, eager to stay on Chike's good side. But among the crowd, a subtle shift had begun, almost imperceptible at first. The waiters moved carefully around the tables, keeping their trays steady, but some exchanged quiet glances. Tund, especially, kept stealing looks at Amara, noticing her serene composure even as Chike's words cut through the room. A few businessmen leaned closer to one another, whispering just softly enough for their companions to hear. They recognized her handwriting on contracts, the signature of Zenith Tech on recent agreements, the discreet but unmistakable mark of a company they knew had quietly dominated the tech market for years. The tension in the room started to thicken. Chike didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the attention, boasting about his network, his influence, his wealth. Yet around him, whispers began to travel like wildfire. A glance here, a murmured, "Wait a minute" there. Some of the guests who had been laughing at Amara's expense suddenly paused, sensing something off. Others tried to hide the curiosity in their eyes, but the energy in the room had shifted. Amara noticed it too. She felt it in the air, the way conversations faltered for a split second when she walked by, the small, careful way people examined her, the subtle nods from businessmen who had finally connected the dots. Her calm exterior remained unshaken, but inside, a quiet satisfaction began to grow. She had always known this day could come, the moment when her hidden power would ripple through the glittering circles of Lagos elite. Chike, oblivious, continued to dominate the stage, unaware of the quiet storm gathering at his feet. Laughter still bubbled around him, but it was different now, strained, uneasy, tinged with something like disbelief. He was still the loudest in the room, but the room itself was starting to shift. And all the while, Amara's eyes remained serene, her mind steady, ready for the moment when the truth she had kept hidden would finally step into the light. The whispers grew, spreading like sparks in dry grass. A few businessmen glanced at their phones, checked emails, and exchanged looks that said everything without words. The tension was rising. Tonight, Chike's spotlight was blinding, but it was about to be stolen, and Amara was the one holding the power to do it. The room had grown louder, Chike's voice cutting through the music and chatter like a blade. He laughed at his own joke, mocking Amara again in front of the guests. "Really, she has no idea about business. Can't even run a small charity properly," he sneered, gesturing toward her as if proving a point. Polite laughter followed, a few uncomfortable chuckles sprinkled in, but most people still hung on his words, captivated by his confidence. Tund had been watching quietly from the edges, holding his tray like always, but inside, something had shifted. He had seen her strength, noticed the quiet power beneath her calm face. Every laugh at her expense tightened a knot in his chest. He had spent the evening observing, waiting, understanding that she was far more than Chike's shadow. And now, something inside him refused to stay silent. Taking a deep breath, Tund stepped forward. He set down the tray carefully, making sure it didn't clatter, and straightened his back. For a moment, the room barely noticed, caught up in Chike's performance. Then Tund's voice rang out, soft, steady, but impossible to ignore. "Excuse me," he said, catching everyone's attention. "Madam Amara, owner of Zenith Tech." The words hung in the air. Silence spread through the ballroom like a wave. Glasses paused midair, conversations stopped, and heads turned. All eyes were on her. Amara froze for just a heartbeat, shock and disbelief flashing across her face. Tun didn't look away. He met her gaze with respect, with certainty, and something else, trust. The room felt heavy, filled with the sudden realization that everything they had assumed about her was wrong. Chaik's confident smile faltered. The laughter he had relied on to defend his ego died on his voice, which had dominated the space all evening, suddenly seemed small, hollow. Amara's chest rose and fell, her calmness returning like a tide reclaiming the shore. She looked at Tund, the young waiter who had risked everything to speak the truth, and a faint smile touched her lip. For years, she had hidden her identity, had allowed herself to be dismissed, underestimated, ignored. And now, in one quiet declaration, the world could no longer do that. The guests, powerful men and women who had laughed at her earlier, stared in disbelief. A few businessmen whispered to one another, nodding, connecting the dots. Investors leaned in, eyes wide, suddenly aware of the real power standing quietly in front of them. Chaik stood frozen, his mind scrambling, trying to grasp the truth that had just been spoken. Amara didn't move or speak immediately. She let the silence fill the room, letting everyone feel the weight of what Tund had revealed. The young waiter's bold move had shifted everything, and in that moment, the balance of the room changed. No one could ignore her now. No one could dismiss her. And Chaik, the man who had mocked her, finally realized the quiet force he had underestimated all along. The room felt different all at once. One moment, it had been filled with polite laughter at Chaik's jokes, and the next, every conversation had stilled, every eye turned toward Amara. Tun's words had cut through the noise like a spark in dry wood, and now the air vibrated with recognition. People who had been laughing at her a few moments ago now approached her with deference, almost bowing slightly as they spoke. CEOs, some of the most powerful men and women in Lagos, extended their hands first, their faces serious, almost reverent. "It's an honor to finally meet you, Madam Amara," one said, voice low and respectful. Another nodded. "We've heard of Zenith Tech's work, truly groundbreaking." Investors who had been sipping champagne and checking their phones now leaned in, nodding, their eyes wide with the weight of realization. They whispered among themselves, adjusting their strategies in real time, suddenly aware that the quiet woman at the table held the leverage they had been chasing all evening. Chaik's smile had vanished. He stood frozen in place, holding a glass of wine that now felt heavy in his hand. The room he had dominated with words and charm was shifting beneath him. The men and women who had nodded and laughed at his arrogance were now shifting their loyalty, their attention, and their respect to Amara. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, but the words that usually commanded attention faltered and disappeared. Amara remained composed, her face calm, her hands folded gently in front of her. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She let the recognition come naturally, letting the room understand without her saying a word. Each handshake, each nod, each whispered word of acknowledgement felt like justice settling quietly into place. The more powerful guests flocked to her, the more Chaik realized the truth he had ignored all these years. The useless woman he had ridiculed, who had seemed invisible and quiet, was the one who actually held the keys to influence, wealth, and power in the room. His empire of charm and boasts suddenly seemed fragile, almost meaningless compared to the network Amara had built silently. He watched as she smiled politely, accepted greetings with grace, and exchanged a few quiet words that commanded respect without raising her voice. The room revolved around her now, and he had no control over it. Panic and disbelief flickered across his face. Every deal he thought was his, every hand he had shaken expecting loyalty, now felt hollow. Amara's presence filled the room in a way Chaik never could. Power was no longer measured by noise or brash confidence. It was in quiet knowledge, respect earned, and influence that no one could buy or boast about. And as she stood there, the room acknowledging her, Chaik finally understood. The woman he had belittled, the one he had tried to make invisible, was far richer, smarter, and more powerful than he would ever be. The glittering party, once his stage, had become hers. Chaik's hands shook slightly as he raised his glass, trying to reclaim the attention that had slipped from him. I was just, he began, his voice faltering under the weight of dozens of eyes that no longer sought him. The charm and confidence that had carried him through so many rooms now seemed hollow, meaningless. Every word he spoke was met with polite nods, but no one listened. No one cared. He tried to laugh it off, raising his voice a little, attempting a joke about Amara's hidden talents. But the effect was gone. The room had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. Deals that had been whispered about in corners, promises made with smiles and handshakes, were quietly being redirected. Investors who had once sought his attention now leaned toward Amara, discussing contracts, shares, and future collaborations. His name, once a magnet for opportunity, had become a whisper in the background, barely remembered. Chaik's face drained of color. He tried to speak to one businessman, leaning in as if to whisper a deal or remind him of a previous agreement. But the man nodded politely and then moved toward Amara instead. Every attempt to regain control failed. Every familiar strategy, bragging, showing off, commanding attention, crashed against the new reality that Amara held the real power. He glanced around the room, panic rising like a tide. The same guests who had laughed at him, hung on his every word, now bowed their heads slightly to Amara, shaking her hand, thanking her, acknowledging her influence. The shift was complete. Chaik realized, with a sinking heart, that he had built his empire on perception, on the illusion of power. But the truth was undeniable. The woman he had mocked, the useless wife he had belittled, had the influence, the money, and the respect that he had only pretended to command. He tried again, raising his voice over a group of investors, attempting to reclaim his narrative, but the words fell flat. They were no longer listening. They didn't need him anymore. He had become invisible in the very circle he had once tried to dominate, a ghost at his own party. The laughter and chatter that had once fueled him now seemed like mockery, though no one even knew they were doing it intentionally. Chaik's confidence, carefully constructed over years, crumbled quietly in front of everyone. No one stopped to console him. No one leaned in to reassure him. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer the man everyone wanted to impress. The room moved around him, flowing toward Amara's orbit, leaving him stranded in a space he thought was his. For the first time, he felt small, truly small. Not in front of a crowd, not in some fleeting embarrassment, but in the full, quiet, undeniable way of realizing that the foundation of his pride, his identity, and his influence had been nothing compared to the woman he had spent years trying to diminish. And as he looked at her, glowing with calm authority, he understood the cruelest truth. He had underestimated her, and the world would never let him forget it. Amara stood in the center of the room, her posture calm, her smile soft but commanding. The whispers had spread, the nods and handshakes had been exchanged, and the guests were finally seeing her for who she truly was. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to argue or insult anyone, not even Chaik. Every gesture, every quiet word, radiated a power that no shouting could ever match. She turned to Tund, the young waiter who had dared to speak her name aloud, and gave him a gentle nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm, steady, and full of gratitude. It was enough. The simple acknowledgement carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. Around her, the room shifted again. People who had been focused on her husband now focused entirely on her. Respect, admiration, and even awe rippled through the crowd, unspoken but undeniable. Chaik sat frozen at a corner table, a glass of untouched wine in his hand. He had lost his audience, his influence, and his pride, all without a single harsh word from Amara. The people he had tried to impress now walked past him, seeking her attention, her advice, her approval. Every deal he thought he controlled had quietly shifted away. He was invisible, a shadow in the bright light Amara now commanded. Amara walked toward the grand exit, the crowd parting respectfully as she moved. Each step was measured, graceful, and full of quiet triumph. The music, the laughter, the glittering lights, all of it seemed to celebrate her without anyone needing to say it aloud. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her silence was her victory. That night, as the doors closed behind her, Amara left the party as the true queen of the night. Chaik remained alone, a reminder that arrogance and cruelty could never outweigh patience, intelligence, and quiet strength. In the world of power, Amara had shown that words are nothing compared to presence, and silence can be the sharpest kind of revenge.